We began working on this project some time ago, before the disastrous election in the United States. Otherwise, we would have, although it redefines urban, I must tell you, because we now have the urbans versus the non-urbans in the United States, but maybe we can talk about that later in terms of public space. We're not sure when the light bulb became a metaphor for a new idea, nor do we know when smart people were considered to be bright. Some have attributed the light bulb metaphor to a silent film era, particularly Felix the Cat, an animated cartoon. When Felix was thinking, symbols and letters would sometimes appear over his head, and he would often use them as props. Question marks became ladders and musical notes became vehicles. It was in these symbolic images that we first saw the light bulb used to represent a new idea. But the light bulb is also a great way to introduce our possibly brilliant, meant to be a pun by the way, remark about what it literally demonstrates about the impact of technology. I don't know whether any of you have attempted to buy a light bulb recently, but we no longer can buy in the United States incandescent light bulbs, but rather the children of incandescent light bulbs. That is, it's been replaced by the light-emitting diode bulb, the LED.
We have been fascinated and horrified, amazed, exhilarated, and cautioned by the extraordinary acceleration of communication technology. Truly, one cannot not communicate. Now, back eons ago, in 1985,
when I was a baby,
Robert Cathcart, one of my other mentors, and Gary Gumpert wrote Media Grammars and Generation Gaps. And I hate to admit it, but this has been a defining essay that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage, but it's one of the defining essays that's guided a great deal of our work and my work over the years. Now, this essay basically took a fundamental position that a generation, once defined and bound by a number of years, could be described by the technological environment into which one enters the world. Now, I guess we could play some games here. We can ask, perhaps not you, but ask some of your students. Have any of you ever used a typewriter?
how many have not? Oh, a couple people.
I have a typewriter in the garage. I plan on making it into a lamp. How many of you have ever dialed a telephone?
How many of you have not? Oh, come on. When we say dial, that means putting your finger in and moving the rotating device.
That sensory experience.
That's dialing.
Now, how many of you have ever held a negative of a photograph in your hand?
I'm expecting.
All right, so that's still special. That's not. Or I look at a student and sometimes they'll ask, what is film? It's a concept. It's not something tactile. Certainly, most of you have probably not played a long playing record, although they are coming back. At least my students are saying, that it's an interesting thing to come back to. But basically, we listen to music through downloads or maybe CDs. But how about an audio cassette? Anybody own an audio cassette player? 8-track? Pushing it, 8-track. But the point is, back in 1985, Gumpert and Cathcart stated the obvious. They were very good at that. That the world was defined not just by invention and technology, but also by the speed of the introduction of the invention into consciousness. So the interval between the insertion and the diffusion of the communication innovation into our physical and psychic awareness constitute a media generation. Now, between 1985 and 2016, a period of 28 years, we experienced a complication, another development, that of convergence. In 1985, media grammar and generation gaps referred to the introduction of a discrete identifiable medium. It would introduce radio or black and white television. You then move to color television or hi-fi, stereophonic sound. But in 2016, the phenomenon of technological convergence, we have multiple discrete communication technologies that are seamlessly integrated into newer innovations. And as a result of digitalization, one technology could be absorbed into another. We can listen to the radio on a computer. We can watch film and television on our iPads. We can telephone utilizing almost any electronic device from anywhere at no cost. We can perform multiple functions. Some of you may be taking notes right now. Some of you may be interested in what we're saying. Others may be recording what is being said. Some of you may be texting or surfing the net at the same time, particularly if we're boring you. So now we have been accused of being, perhaps wrongly, technological or media determinists. At the very least, we see the world through communication and media colored glasses, and frequently the media we look at are unidentifiable as discrete entities. We like to talk about this being an era of a media identity crisis. Media convergence means that technology is multimodal and multi-purpose. The radio is audio. Television is audio and video. Both are accessible on phones, on iPads, on computers, on wristwatches, etc. So increasingly, the single-purpose medium is becoming obsolete, which in turn has led us to question whether perhaps the same might be said about the single-purpose facade. Now, our own personal academic journey, only in hindsight do we reveal reasons, and a bit of sanity, have been subjected to...
You're saying.
There are days. Been subjected to technological transformation. No one is immune, least of all us. And we've gravitated in our own scholarly endeavors from broadcasting, where Gary began, to the regulation of public space, where I began, to merging that and then moving on in our work to looking at the urban landscape. And in the process, we became academic flaneurs, the children of Baudelaire, who roam the streets of every city that we find ourselves in, seeking to discover who we are and where we are and why. That one's harder. Now, the street has essentially become our playground because it is a thoroughfare of memory that speaks to us. Now, this process of discovery is not easy, and it's risky, and it's tricky to find that we need to elevate and catalog what we see and what we feel and what we sense and touch, what we smell, into our academic and theoretical lexicon. It's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it. When we first decided to submit an essay to the volume Ambient Screens in Transnational Public Spaces, we did so not really knowing what we would discover. I hate to admit that. What would emerge from a mysterious process of academic introspection? We wrote our chapter having gone through a considerable period of gestation in which we tried to explain how the urban landscape is a communicative one. And so Melbourne has, just in the last couple of days, become our new playground in which to absorb what is and to question how will we be when we leave and what do we take with us. Now, over a long period of time, we have tried to express a process of analysis, a communication schema, from which a city can be examined, but only after you take the time to really walk the streets.
You're one of the great street walkers of our time.
Yes, my parents are so proud. So the schema that we've developed basically focuses on these characteristics, these aspects of experiencing a city. Looking at the city as a place for social interaction, the city as a place of structures, buildings and materials themselves. The old lawyer in me, we have to go back to the city as defined by the regulatory process, the city as an amalgam of infrastructures, and they become more and more interesting and complex, and the city of imagination and representation. And by that, we're really looking at everything from cinematic representations of the city, artistic representations, literary, musical representations. We almost burst into song downtown Petula Clark. We held that. The point is that
you haven't stopped yet.
That's true. There's always time. So, in our many years of searching for the essence of the city, through the bias of our communication colored glasses, in retrospect, we continually keep gravitating back towards a sensibility that the urban structure in particular speaks to us in many, many languages. That idea of structure becomes more and more powerful in our thinking. We addressed this early in our essay in the volume, The Inside-Outside Equation, Building Skins and Screens. Now, while the concept, in the volume, I'm giving it a plug. So while the concept of ambient screens is a far-reaching concept that involves both big and little screens, we're particularly entranced by the transformation of the edifice, the construction, and how buildings speak to us.
By the way, just in case, that's a photograph we took in Quito at Habitat. And it's an extraordinary public space in which there had to be probably 5,000 people every night.
Standing in the pouring rain to see the projection change throughout the evening on the major churches. So, in our chapter, we noted, frequently the exteriors of buildings communicate by adding an additional layer of communication technology infrastructure, be it building skins or articulated urban screens or projection. Urban outdoor screens and related infrastructures are more than displays adorning structures, sometimes incorporated as an organic part of the structure, no longer just the exterior displays adorning structures. The dialectic between inside and outside offers tantalizing and communicative issues and options. We went on to say that the quandary is essentially how to articulate the connection between inside and outside. What are the boundaries and the connections between the two? Do modern technologically enhanced exteriors alter the relationship between outside and inside? When is an exterior not just an exterior? And when is a screen not just a screen? So that was the beginning of an incredible intellectual trip that found us hopping and skipping between disciplines and different theorists.
We have a very sophisticated research tool. It's called the bumble theory. It simply means that we don't know what we're doing, and we stumble from one idea to another.
No, we're dangerous because we think we know what we're doing, but we're open enough to realize when we find something really important. So, besides a strange connection that we played with, trying to link inside and outside, we began something even stranger, looking at the connection between architecture and tattoos. And if you're interested in this bizarre bumped into link, you're going to have to read the book.
And we get a little cutback from the book.
So there are several other examples that document our strange cerebral journey. Over 30 years ago, we visited South Beach in Miami, Florida. And we were fascinated by the Art Deco facades of the small hotels that face the ocean front. But we found, actually we've never published this, we found that there was very little connection between inside and outside, particularly the inside and outside of those structures as they were renovated in the 1980s in an attempt to restore the creations of the 1930s. Basically, it was attenuated, it was essentially cosmetic. Now, some years later, deep in the heart of Manhattan, already mesmerized by Times Square, we met and were fascinated by one of our first zippers, or was it a facade? We stared at changing facades at this corner as the images and the messages moved around the entire lower floors of the building, not including the ground floor. And there we were, the light bulb, and communication had become inseparable partners, leading us to the aesthetics of the urban screen. It was a vivid demonstration of the complex merging of structures, digitalization, and social interaction.
Now, the basic idea for the eventual chapter that emerged began over 3 years ago, and are linked to several other previous scattered antecedents in our sophisticated research method. In our essay, we mentioned the concept of media ecology, a school of thought often attributed to Neil Postman and to Marshall McLuhan. In his book on Postman, Lat Straight described media ecology as the study of information environments. While a medium is understood as a type of context, it can also be a space in which physical attributes can structure the communicative interaction. Straight further explains Postman's conception of media ecology to understand how technologies and techniques of communication control the form, the quantity, the speed, the distribution, and the direction of information, and how, in turn, such information configures our biases and affects people's perceptions, values, and attitudes. I need to go back a little bit further. I feel a little bit like the journey of Doctor Who, but I want to go back just for a moment, back to 1960. 56 years ago, one of us was asked by his senior professor, is that you or me?
I sincerely hope they think it's you.
I think it's me. We were supposed to go to the Merle Palmer Institute in Detroit to attend a lecture, and that's where I first met Marshall McLuhan. Several days later, I was a graduate student at that time. I was younger at one time, and I was asked to go to this lecture, and I was told that I would be working and doing a television program with Marshall McLuhan, and that I would be producing and directing it. It was a television production called The Gutenberg Galaxy. It's the worst program I have ever produced and directed in my entire life. It was hidden in a closet in my great neck home for many years until I had the guts to look at it again. But you must understand, he was not easy to work with, but we did enjoy each other over a series of bottles of scotch that we had together over this next several months. But during our presentation, he was very difficult. He insisted on smoking, and the ashes kept flicking around. It was a live production, and it was kinescope. I don't know whether any of you know what a kinescope is. It is essentially a television production filmed off of a screen. Now, several years after that, after our production, McLuhan wrote a letter to me. He wrote some very interesting letters to me, but I'll read it to you. The advantage of the concept of the extensions of man is that everyone can see at once that any extension modifies the existing sense ratios, whether in the individual or in the society. It also becomes easy to see why the extension is the crux in effecting change and not the content. The content is always another medium which had its impact earlier. And this, of course, he was calling the Gutenberg Galaxy. And he never gave me credit. I was really, can I say, pissed about that, but he did not give me credit. Now that takes us to the crux of the matter, that our senses and their relationship to the processing of the urban landscape is the issue. It also takes us back to the concept of building skins that we discussed in the ambient screens and the changing display facades of buildings.
The first electronic billboard began functioning in Times Square in 1928. It was known as the zipper, certainly an interesting metaphor.
Yeah, why do they call it the zipper? I'm not even sure. I've never been able to find that out.
Well, it opens up the building, tells you what's inside. We discovered the building skin again when we bumped into, again, our research technique, when we bumped into the Lehman Brothers building, now defunct, not the building, but the company. Now this is a building on 49th Street and 7th Avenue in Manhattan, and we were intrigued by what we saw, because what we saw were images on the facade that seemed to add to the structure, but we wondered, is this an appendage? You know, how is this building speaking to us? What is it saying? And that took us to the conclusion, which is where we actually could have begun our comments this morning. The conclusion that a building is not simply a building, and that an ambient screen is more than a public space. It's more than a public space option when it's humanized.
That's a remarkable photograph, by the way, we took in Chicago. I don't know whether you've seen the series of images. There are two pylons, one at each end, and those images are constantly changing and almost speak to the people as they're walking around.
And the two seem to interact with each other from one end of the plaza to the other. Well, this also takes us back to Times Square and the sad story of the original New York Times Tower and skins. So in the beginning there, and in the end, we keep coming back to Times Square. Built in 1905, the newspaper outgrew the building in a very short period of time, in a 10-year period of time. And the building itself started to be billboarded over. In the 1960s, Allied Chemical reskinned the old steel frame of the office building. And it served basically no tenants for a period. It served as a site for billboards in the center of Times Square. Some of you might recall that since this was the crossroads of the world, Hodling's out-of-town newspaper stand that was on the north side of Times Square, and that also became a victim of technological change. So it was our assumption that the structural concept of the skin is a result of glass technology being incorporated into the design of contemporary architecture. In 2006, Peter Hall at the Design Institute in New York asked the following question: what if a building could respond in real time to the movement of people, the weather, or the whims of bystanders or behind-the-scenes artists? Digital designers and architects have begun working together to move beyond the facade and give buildings a living skin. This is just a sample of the kind of interactivity between outside and inside of weather conditions.
A building in Switzerland.
Can get more dramatic, but we don't have to wait for the text.
So buildings can breathe, give up light, can be green, and they are to a great degree anthropomorphic. Further academic meandering led us to 19th century Germany. And this is, I got very excited by this. I get excited easily. But we found the newly science of hygiene developing in Germany at that point. And the work of someone I love pronouncing is Max von Pettenkofer. Now, I want to say that again. I love Max von Pettenkofer. He was not really on that screen. We put that there. But he was a first physician to link skin, clothing, and dwelling. And in a 2016 article by Didier Akichi, which I recommend highly, at the University of Nottingham, he wrote an essay called Skin, Clothing, and Dwellings, Max von Pettenkofer, The Science of Hygiene and Breathing Walls. Akichi points out that architects adopted the theory that equated clothing and the dwellings, and that it came from physicians. And while we thought ourselves to be very clever in connecting tattoos and architecture, Akichi indicated that by, quote, by rendering the body's structure contours visible on the skin, tattoos became the earliest structure symbolic art form. Now, our fascination with skins and public space and ambient screens brought us to another extraordinary link and the work of a Finnish architect named Juhani Pallasmaa. Anyone ever hear of him? Oh, what an exciting human being this is. I just fell in love for the 50th time. He wrote the book called The Eyes of the Skin, Architecture and the Senses. This thin little volume emerged out of Pallasmaa's general unhappiness with contemporary architecture, that he passionately connected to the wider-ranging tyranny of technology. He says the hegemony of vision has been reinforced in our time by a multitude of technological inventions and the endless multiplication and production of images. He goes on to say, instead of an existentially grounded plastic and spatial experience, architecture has adopted the psychological strategy of advertising instant persuasion. Buildings have been turned into image products, detached from existential depth and sincerity. He refers to the philosopher David Michael Levin's concept of frontal ontology to describe frontal, fixated, and focused vision. That's what we're essentially referring to. And that the increased use of reflective glass in architecture reinforces the dreamlike sense of unreality and alienation. Now, we're not the first to connect the tyranny of the camera with our general sensibilities. Susan Sontag did some marvelous work on photography. I mentioned Marshall McLuhan. I could have also dealt with Walter Ahn. All of them reverberate and lead us into the realm of sense ratios, and they're linked to communication technology. But it is Pallasmaa who applies shifting sensibilities to communicating structures and the role of the senses in an urban realm. I confront the city with my body. My legs measure the length of the arcade and the width of the square. My gaze unconsciously projects my body into the facade of the cathedral, where it roams over the moldings and contours, sensing the sizes of recess and projections. My body weight meets the mass of the cathedral door, and my hand grabs the door pull as I enter the dark void behind. I experience myself in the city, and the city exists through my embodied experience. The city and my body supplement and define each other. I dwell in the city, and the city dwells in me. And he approaches the realm of architecture, and he evaluates the efficacy of any structure and the degree to which our senses are addressed, whether it is sight, whether it is hearing, smell,